And we're live. All right, welcome to the Theories of Nothing, guys. We're a community of nobodies discussing the nature of reality and truth. Please know there's nothing here to like and or subscribe to. So today we have J. Aaron Simmons. He's a philosopher, a PhD, working in the States in sorry, which university?
At Furman University. It's in Greenville, South
Furman.
Carolina. Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, I'd like you to introduce yourself, Aaron, if you could,
No,
please.
happy to. No, well, thanks, James, for having me on. It's an honor to think with you and think about things that matter. And so I'm stoked to be on here. Yeah, so I'm a professor of philosophy at Furman University. My specialty is postmodern philosophy of religion, and then I also do quite a bit of political theory as well, political philosophy. Started as a physicist in college and kind of quickly made a turn away from that, ended up getting 2 degrees in history, and then finally landed in philosophy and then did 2 graduate degrees in philosophy. Yeah, the reason I guess I do what I do is because my dad was a professor of art and I got to fish with him all the time. And I thought, my goodness, I'm so down for any career that lets me trout fish all the time. So I wish there was sort of a more noble reason I had gotten into philosophy, but it was because I thought that's pretty cool if I get to go fishing. Went to Florida State for my first graduate degree simply because I was a Seminoles fan. And so I thought, what better reason to go to grad school than to cheer for an American football team? So did that and then, won a national championship and then kind of veered into, all right, let's get serious about academics and have, get my PhD at Vanderbilt and now have been teaching for almost 20 years and published a bunch of books and a bunch of articles and have over the last couple of years been doing an enormous amount of public intellectual work and started a YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves, launched a new website recently that has monthly newsletters that go out, jaaronsimmons.com. I've got a 13-year-old son named Atticus and a wife named Vanessa. Been married 22 or 23 years. And yeah, otherwise, I love mountain biking, was a professional drummer for a long time. And, I'd always rather be in the mountains, I guess is the way to put it.
Okay. See, I like that because, philosophy to me, I think is important if you apply it to your life. So I love how everything you're talking about, all the activities that you've done, and it's so, disparate and sporadic in a way. There's so many different kinds of things that you're doing. And that's the point, right? Like, what is philosophy is usually thought of as something that's completely abstract, it has no practical application. But really, if to me, philosophy is ultimately the most practical thing. It's just you've decided to go and observe your metaphysical assumptions and try to think about your life a little bit. But for what? Well, so as to apply it, right? So I would imagine you're probably thinking a lot when you're fishing, just chilling out there
Oh yeah,
on the
yeah.
water. Yeah.
My most recent book. It's not been published yet. My agent has it and is shopping it around at presses, but it's simply called "Camping with Kierkegaard." And it's all about the question, what is worthy of our finitude. And so for me, what's worthy of my finitude is trying to be a good father and good husband and a good member of my democracy and a good professor and all these things. But it's
Yeah.
also doing things with my time that blows my hair back and makes me okay with this story that my life has turned out to be is one that I'm pretty cool with telling. And so, yeah, I spend a lot of time on mountain bikes and, a lot of time thinking philosophically with people I ride with and fish with and, pretty content. It's a pretty good life.
Oh, that's great. Speaking of living a pretty good life, it's a good segue into because you mentioned that you've been doing a lot of work in a public intellectual space, and that you have a channel now, and that you're promoting philosophy insofar as something you can apply to your life. And I think nowadays that's really what people are looking for, and maybe for the first time in a very long time, if ever, philosophy is starting to be seen as something central and absolutely necessary for this next step in human evolution, or if you could say, to get through this technological singularity and so on. So let me give you a bit of a background or context insofar as what my intentions are here for this discussion today. So obviously, like the channel is called Theories of Nothing, It emerged out of the Theories of Everything community and channel that Kurt Jaimungal started. Um, and really, it was just to give a sort of dual counterpart to the physics side of things. Because typically in the Theories of Everything, we're talking about things, we're talking about material reductionism, physics, theoretical physics, and so on. And people really want to unify fields, right? Quantum mechanics with classical physics and all these kinds of things. But ultimately, consciousness comes into play. Obviously, we've hit bedrock when it comes to the physics and sciences. And so a lot of these conversations are starting to revolve around more esoteric things, spiritual things, consciousness things, metaphysics. So that's why I felt like there was a need to create a platform where people could start to come together, not only to discuss metaphysics, because this is what Kurt does provide, which I love about the Theories of Everything channel. He does try to bridge the gap between physics and metaphysics. And I think that is really ultimately the crux of what needs to happen in order to create, if not a unified theory, definitely unification in between people and civilizations and so on. So we are literally working towards trying to save the world in some fashion, maybe if you think, and it might be naive and idealistic, but you got to try, and I think that's what we're doing, and I think it's worth it. But the Theories of Nothing community is the same thing, but for people who aren't so prominent and who have something to offer, and so giving a voice to the non-prominent people. And I think eventually maybe connecting folks like yourself with these more prominent people might be a good thing. Because again, if we're talking about unification, we have to be able to unify people, whether they're prominent or not. It has to do with finding the good ideas and finding the right paths and information, and you necessarily have to go deeper and look for it, not just look for it in the space of famous people or people who have already been discovered. So that's what my intention is generally for this community and this channel. But insofar as the conversation I want to have with you now, my intention is to discuss philosophy as a central role in this, because if you look at the Unity Diamond, which is the logo of the Theories of Nothing channel, what that means, and I'm going to make a video on this to put it on the channel so that anyone can just go, but on the website you can click on that and it'll give you a rundown, like a text description as to what the Unity Diamond is about. But really, we have physics, we have math, we have language, which to me is, you could say, is philosophy, right? And then we have the experience of truth. So you could say meditation, spirituality, consciousness, whatever. So ultimately, can we unify these fields? Can we create an alignment between math and physics and philosophy so as to point people towards the experience, what can't be described about reality, right? So I think ultimately language might be the linchpin between math and physics, and I think it is central in that way because most people communicate with language and ideas. So that being said, it's a pleasure you're the first philosopher that I'm interviewing for this channel, which is great. Well, I mean, you could say that other people that I've interviewed are philosophers in their own rights, but they also specialize in their fields. But you're like straight up in philosophy, and so to me, it's exciting because I'm also from the philosophical side, and so my intention here today will be to um, I want to dig deeper in academia, and I want to dig deeper in philosophy, and insofar as it is a tool that we might be able to use, and how should we use it as philosophers that are more professional, if you will, to bring it to the world and make it, bring it down from the heavens and into the hearts and minds of the everyday person, like you seem to be doing with your community, which is great. So like a new Socratic revolution, if you will. Does any of that really move anything in your mind? Do you have any thoughts, reactions about that?
Yeah. So, two, one, this idea of trying to somehow bridge physics and philosophy. It's interesting. I mentioned I started studying physics and went to college to do physics. And once I eventually became a philosopher and was able to kind of look back on, the narrative of my life and how I had gotten to where I was, I now realize that the thing that I loved about physics were all the questions that it posed and it asked. What's the nature of time? What's the nature of identity? How do we make sense of reality? Is it constructed? Is it discovered? All these really complicated questions that especially theoretical physics is invested in. Philosophy is asking all those same questions. The difference is philosophy uses a different tool set to try to get at those questions. So physics, of course, is primarily deploying the tool set of mathematics. Philosophy primarily deploys the tool set of argumentation. And, how is it that we can make sense then of the claims that we are making? What would follow? How do things get entailed? What objections arise? So I actually very much see physics and philosophy intersecting, at least insofar as they are invested in central questions about existence, whether human or not. Yeah. And those questions then allow for very different ways of approaching them, different ways of accessing them. But the second thought I have is you mentioned that, bringing philosophy out of the ivory tower, putting it into practice, into lived existence. When I started my YouTube channel and really kind of pivoted more into the public direction, the reason was COVID had just started. We were like, 2 weeks into the lockdown here in the States. And I kept getting calls from students of mine who were seniors getting ready to graduate, 2 months later or whatever. And they were dropping all of their courses because, as happens in the way a lot of American universities work, you end up taking more classes than you absolutely need to graduate with your degree. And so now we were all back at home. All the courses had gone virtual. Everybody was frustrated and scared. And so seniors who were like, well, look, I only need one of these 4 courses. They dropped the other 3. That way they could graduate, not have to mess with all this work. And it was weird because I kept getting these calls and emails and stuff from students saying, I've dropped my other classes, but I'm keeping philosophy, which is not usually the way things work, right? Philosophy is the discipline that parents get very nervous when their kids say they want to study. And they were keeping philosophy because they kept telling me philosophy seems like it's the only one really able to speak to where we are. And I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly one of the important spaces that can speak, I think, to the human condition, to the vulnerability and relationality that defines it. And so my attempt to kind of pivot into the public space, having, had fairly good traction and success in the academic space, I saw an awful lot of people I respected as philosophers, talking to each other about what was going on, but not many of us were sort of, talking in public and thinking out loud and letting our own struggles and our own fears be represented in thought. And then inviting people to say, hey, let's think together. And especially in a time, I think this is a global phenomenon, but it's certainly the case right now in the United States, of radical political polarization, radical dismissiveness of anybody who disagrees with you, the inability to even take seriously what plausibly would count as evidence for truth. We haven't got to agree about truth. We can't even agree on what would count as evidence. So when that's our context, philosophers have an awful lot, I think, that can be a powerful resource, not for answering the great questions of human existence, but maybe for helping us get more invested in why it matters that we think about these things in charitable ways, in collective ways. And I hope that the work I'm doing invites some of that. I kind of found the niche where I felt comfortable doing this work, and I've been blessed and honored that people seem to be responding to it. But I'm entirely with you. Philosophy, not uniquely, but distinctively, has to find a way to be able to say nuance is not dangerous. It's in fact needed. And civil discourse doesn't mean that we're evacuating our own commitments to justice, right? If I talk to somebody with whom I disagree about moral life, that doesn't mean that I somehow acquiesce or condone their views. It means that this is the only possibility of any kind of transformation that is mutual, that is shared. And I think that ultimately, deliberative democratic projects require that we be able to think well with each other. And so philosophers have got to step up and kind of show, what it looks like to do that as well as we can. And so that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I'd love to see. That's exactly my goal as well. And I would say that, so earlier, just to kind of recap what you were saying, quick question for you, if you can answer it shortly. Would you say that philosophy is in the realm of rationality, and then physics is in the realm of empiricism? Just can we make those two camps, or is that overly simplistic?
I mean, I it's not overly simplistic if what we mean by rationality is discourse and argument, and it's a deliberative process. Then yes. And if by empiricism we mean repeatability and experimental progress that occurs in ways that then is shareable, then
Hmm.
yes.
Yeah,
I'd
because
push back on more precise ways of understanding it, though.
yeah, I would say maybe for me, like the empiricism has to do with it might even fit within rationalism because you know I just see it in the. I'd like people to understand the difference between the two camps and how they relate to each other, just so that they can start to realize like why philosophy might be a bit more important to invest time into. Because philosophy, it's not just a rational endeavor. I mean, you are using the beauty of rationality is that you believe that a truth can be attained or obtained, or more truth can be obtained beyond just empiricism, right? Beyond empirical proof. You can actually, it's more Platonic, I guess, right? But the point is, you can achieve higher truths purely through rationality, which, if you believe that, then you're still including empiricism. I mean, you're going based off of evidence that you find in the natural world as well. So I think that, you know, it's more complete because rationalism uses empiricism. But oftentimes I find that, you know, in the scientific community, the other way around, the other camp, if you will, doesn't really, I mean, they have no choice to use rationality, logic, of course, to some degree, but I don't think they place enough importance in it insofar as like, oh, well, you can't really obtain a higher truth unless you can test it in a
Mm-hmm.
physical manner. And I think that might be detrimental. And it's strange because oftentimes, if you go really far into theoretical physics, well, all they're doing, or most of what they're doing, is philosophy. It seems like, right? I mean, they have to dream up new particles and think about things in terms of more imaginative ways and rational ways than, you know, because how are you going to test something if you don't even have the idea of what you want to test? So you have to use rationality. So I don't know why there seems to be a rift between the empirical and rationalist camps, or is there still a rift? I don't know, but I do know that in the past with like logical positivism, that really seemed to have been like, hey, you know, all that's true is what we can test. Let's not go any further because it's not valid. But anyway, I just wanted to lay that out a little bit to kind of unpack it and get people to understand what we're talking about when it comes to empiricism, rationalism, and, you know, the relationship between the two. But now, um, what I really wanted to get into is you mentioned also this idea that we're politically polarized and all this, and this isn't new. It looks like everyone is starting to wake up. Like, look, there's a process of globalization in a way. We're coming real close to each other. Technology seems to be exponential. It's causing a lot of political, economic, socioeconomic issues, and so on. And now with ChatGPT 4 dropping, it's like all you can
Mm-hmm.
hear about the moratorium on AI research and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, for all intents and purposes, you could say that this is the end of an era and the beginning of a new one. And it's extremely, you can draw a lot of parallels with religion and lots of things that have been, you know, prophesized in the more esoteric circles, right? And so now it's no longer like woo woo. We really are reaching the end of our humanity in a way, or we're facing humanity and what it means to be human because we're evolving so quickly. I mean, we might even split off into different species, what with the biomedical revolution as well. And so you see what I mean? Like, there's so much here and it's so sporadic, and I don't want to just sort of vomit it onto people, but I just want people to understand this is huge. There are many things that come into play. And that being said, um, philosophy, it seems that if people don't apply it themselves, then we really don't have any means for there to be any kind of unification, whether it's between identity groups or political affiliations, you know, countries, that kind of thing. So that's why I think it's important. It all comes down to identity, and the individual to me, which means that, and I was getting close to the crux of my argument here to try to get your opinion on this, but do you believe that if individuals really understand the value of philosophy, because like you said, your students would say, look, this is what I want to study. And I think the reason is because people are, and I'm getting a lot of people who want to study philosophy for different reasons. And I think the reason for that is people have way more time on their hands than they've ever had in history. You can work 25 hours a week, 30 hours a week, and the rest of the time you're playing video games, you're doing whatever. And people really quickly fall down a sort of hedonistic path. You know, they play video games, they masturbate, they drink alcohol, they do whatever. And even if they do more healthy things, they study, they go to the gym, they do whatever, they really quickly realize that I have more axes of freedom and I know what to do with. And they start to realize that freedom in itself might be a worse prison, and that you need constraint. You need some kind of challenge in your life that you never really chose, because there's too much freedom here. I don't know what to do. And growing and learning for what reason? Like, that's why they're faced with all these questions, these like existential crises and so on, precisely because technology is allowing us to have so much time on our hands and so on. So it seems to me that philosophy is the only vehicle that will allow because it's the only tool that individuals can apply for themselves and have to apply for themselves. So I've just given a bit of an expose on the context that I'm talking about here. So the question to you is would you say definitively that philosophy is the answer? Like, it might actually be the only thing that can get us through this immense change and all of this chaos? Can it create order out of the chaos that we're experiencing?
I'm not sure I'd go that far. But again, a lot depends on sort of what we mean by philosophy. If we mean the only way, the only hope for some sort of progress forward in light of the precipice upon which we currently stand, and I think you've laid out lots of the trim tabs that make sense of what this precipice involves and why it's so dangerous. And we could add realities of climate change and the progression of technology, not just in the sense that we're rethinking what it means to be human, but even the ease with which we can destroy all of life. I mean, like these are truths that are facilitated by what we traditionally would call progress. And yet, we might stop to ask, well, progress toward what? And that's a hard question. So if in light of all of that, we say the only hope is philosophy, what I would then mean by philosophy in that sentence is only if we begin to take seriously the fact that we've got to be humble relative to what we hold to be true and hospitable in relation to the discursive possibilities of engagement with others. And then we've got to be grounded in good arguments such that we invite others to participate continuously in that conversation. Then yes, I think those are necessities for any hope going forward. Humility, hospitality, and some mode of evidential investment in broad conversations that are nuanced, that are sophisticated, but then are also fragmentary, right? So I tend to get a little bit nervous about unification theory if what we mean by that is almost a progression toward the spot where then it would all be clear, it would all make sense, everything could be answered. That smacks too much to me of a kind of Hegelian end of history theory. And anytime those sorts of theories get deployed, it always comes at the cost of something else. And I may be more interested in thinking about, well, how can we think about unifying all these threads of the human conversation in ways that invite a more robust, more compelling, and more nuanced conversation and more inclusive conversation. So in that sense, yeah, philosophy is an essential tool for making that happen. But I would also say it's going to require actual rethinking of our technology. It's going to require, public policy being revisited. It's going to require social trust being restored relative to deliberative democratic institutions. And I don't think just thinking well will necessitate those things. We also need,
Yeah.
politicians and political theorists and scientists and IT techs. And so that's where philosophy is the hope opening. But then I would say it's going to open back onto the importance of a really plural conversation.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I don't, I'm not a fan of anything that has to do with extremes, whether it's like deconstructionism to the max or, something the opposite of that, right? Just a rigid structure and then we apply it and it's just like, well, this is the answer. No, but what I mean is more like, yeah, it is the one vehicle that is like in the spotlight at the moment that has to be used. And you could even go a little bit deeper and say, well, really communication, communication is even more fundamental than philosophy, right? So as long as people start to communicate, and then you can go even deeper and say, well, communication doesn't really work if you don't have virtues where, for example, emotional temperance, where when you communicate with someone who has an idea that's different than yours, you just get angry and then all of a sudden you're not able to communicate properly anymore, right? So, if you keep on getting more fundamental, you start to realize, well, the answer is love. It always is love and virtues and so on. But how do you get people to realize that? It ultimately starts with ideas and that are communicated well. So people who have the articulation and the empathetic, drive and the emotional temperance to be able to sit there in front of someone that is completely against you and who is really, angry and embittered, but to be able to speak to them in such a manner that they understand what you're talking about and you've swayed them, to realize that, maybe it is worth thinking about my role as an individual in my own life and my position in society. And so if this can sort of spread among individuals rather than just in various institutions that are so hyper specialized that they don't realize the bigger picture, this is what I mean, like by trying to create a grassroots movement is having philosophy brought into the hearts of every individual on the planet in some way. And maybe without them even realizing it doesn't have to be, hey, you're going to learn about critical thinking and how to craft syllogisms and understand, the difference between Kant's categorical imperatives and some other system, all that stuff that people just their eyes glaze over. I just mean like, what Rogan is doing and other podcasters, right? People they're thirsty for knowledge and wisdom, but at the same time, they need a vehicle where they can put that into practice themselves. It's not enough to just soak in the information; you have to apply it. But everything you've said you're absolutely right. Like it's very typical for a philosopher to do what you just did. It's incredibly nuanced, and I really appreciate the talent that you have in doing that. So.
Well, I mean, one of the things, though, that's I would just sort of add as a footnote, because what you're saying I think is right. It's philosophy is complicated as a social practice because it's one of, not uniquely, but it is one of, I think, the hardest fields of expertise to convince people who are non-experts that expertise in this matters. So we are all very excited about having mechanics that are amazing at fixing motorcycles and cars and boats. And it's easy to say, I don't have that expertise. I'm taking my car to the Toyota dealer, right? There's no hard sell or high bar to clear to get people to take their car to the mechanic. It's easy to get people to realize, oh, you need brain surgery? Don't call the mechanic. Call the neurosurgeon. This is, again, these are not high bars. Philosophy is weird because it's very easy for people to think that what professional philosophers are not much more than just opinionated people using big words. And that, I think, is a real detriment because in also a globalized context in which we find ourselves, the rise of especially right-wing populism is challenging even the need for expertise as a social good. which is a disastrous challenge for what it's worth. We can be maximally humble and grassroots and deliberative and democratic and recognize that's why we need people who are really, really good at what they do, thinking with us all and finding ways to collaborate and work together. But I'm still going to go to the mechanic and go to the neurosurgeon. The philosopher tends to be perceived as not much more than a talking head on some 24-hour news channel, but way less compelling because we're not really good at clickbait, right? We're not real good at like little phrases that can be tweeted. We're not good at, I was on YouTube this morning looking at stuff about Trump's indictment and arraignment and all this going on in the United States. And it was fascinating to me. All these different news organizations were putting up little clips from their recent day's coverage, but all of them with so-and-so claims Trump is blah. And you're like, well, philosophers don't do that really, right? Because part of what we're trying to do is say our expertise is not, we can answer these questions, listen to us, fall in line. That's not what philosophical expertise looks like. When the mechanic says you need a new transmission, you probably just need a new transmission. You can go get a second opinion. When the neurosurgeon says, hey, you've got X going on, you can get a second opinion. And they say X going on. Eventually, we just defer to them. Philosophy is weird because it's not asking for deference, right? Philosophy is asking for cultivating the practices that we model really, really well, hopefully. And then we say, so now put this into practice in your own life and let's think together. And that's a hard sell to people who either want just to consume it, right? It becomes a consumable good. Give me this data, give me this content. Or they want people who do not make them feel like they don't know what they're talking about. And for what it's worth, this is part of why I find Rogan so interesting, is because he has some areas that he is legitimately an expert, right? He's been an actor. He can talk expertly about, the functioning of Hollywood. He spent his life in physical fitness and MMA. These are things he can talk about with actual practical expertise. But 90% of the stuff he talks about, he's just talking. And I love the fact that he's modeling, hey, let's think about these big questions. Let's talk about this. Let's get involved. The tricky part is, how do you do that in a way that isn't then reducible to, and how can we sell it, right? How do we then make sure that this is what people will, continue to want to buy and purchase? Philosophy, when it's done at the expert level, is never telling people believe what we're saying. It's saying, hey, maybe what we're doing and the way we do it is something that is also a good for you. And maybe when you make it a good for you, you will have criticisms of the views and the beliefs and the practices that we hold. We're, as philosophers, as experts, really excited to rethink our own commitments. And that's a thing that is, again, a hard sell. People don't like rethinking their commitments. They want to just feel like they're very smart in thinking about all kinds of stuff. Philosophy really does require like being willing to say, shoot, that argument beats the view I hold. I'm going to have to change my mind on this. So it's important as people think about like what it would look like to embrace philosophy and appropriate philosophy. It means simultaneously to appreciate the social good of philosophical expertise, which I think right now we do not appropriate and don't appreciate. But B, it means to realize that that is expertise that does not tell us now what to do. It invites us into a way of living that is itself probably a good, right? It's by definition already closer to what a life well lived probably involves. Even if we then disagree about politics, about justice, about moral life, about religion, if we're doing that disagreement philosophically, we are probably closer to living well, inhabiting those disagreements. And that's a thing where I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm hopeful. I'm certainly trying, right? I'm trying. My practices are trying to model that and invite people. But it's tricky because like my brother told me the other day, he was like, man, do you realize like every 13-year-old who has a YouTube channel where all they're doing is just playing video games and live streaming it, they've all got 20, 50, 100,000 followers. My son's 13 and he watches all of them. I'm doing like 5 to 10-minute videos once a week about, I think, important ideas that are made accessible, made practical. Half the time it's on a river or in a mountain or whatever. And it's like pulling teeth to get people to watch more than 2 minutes of a 6-minute video, right? And maybe it's me, maybe I'm just not good at it, but that's the thing where if we're gonna do philosophy kind of in a broad social way, I think it's got to be something that we also start recognizing. Being an expert in this is not therefore we should shut up and listen. It's we need to celebrate this expertise so that we can realize the experts in this area are the first to be interested in listening to our replies. And that, I think, is different than neuroscience, different than car mechanics, different than even physics. And those are games that are played by experts for experts. And then they hand over results to the public. Philosophy invites the public to become philosophical. And that's a move that's rare. And I think it's definitely needed. I think it's necessary, just not sufficient for, what we need to do together.
Yeah. So you've really explained, I think, what a philosopher does in a very detailed manner, which is great. And so it leads me to asking you then, how do you define a philosopher? So now we've kind of discussed what a philosopher does and why philosophy is kind of something that people have an aversion to. But how would you define a philosopher now?
Yeah, so I actually have a definition that I use a lot. I think, said it publicly in my TEDx talk I did years ago. I define a philosopher not as somebody who has a PhD, not as somebody who's a professor. A philosopher is someone who lives their life putting question marks where everybody else puts periods. And that's it. Another way to put that same point is a philosopher is the person who takes seriously what everyone else takes for granted, right? And notice, a mechanic can therefore be a philosopher. The neuroscientist can be a philosopher. Joe Rogan can be a philosopher. So it's not in any sense saying you have to get all this advanced training. It's, are you willing to live into these virtues of humility and hospitality? Are you willing to say, even if my conversation with that person with whom I disagree, even if that conversation leads me to have to rethink my views, am I willing to do it? And if we say, no, I'm not, then I would say, well, you're not a philosopher. You're just play acting, right? It's like somebody, takes on the role of philosopher in some movie. Like, yeah, but we need more than that. And being a philosopher is not about getting degrees. It's not about reading a bunch of fancy books, by German and French phenomenologists. Philosophy is about putting question marks where everybody puts periods, in order that our lives then be known by where we return and put periods down, right? So it's not just questions all the time. It's question in order to stand on purpose.
Yeah, so that's where it becomes a little iffy, because I have my own saying that kind of reiterates what your definition is, and I've said this a few times. I came up with a quote, which is that answers are only better questions waiting to be asked. So, ultimately, it's the same thing. I think where there are periods, you should, draw a question mark. But that's where it gets iffy. Now, you're inviting chaos every time you do that. And people don't like chaos. They want certainty, like you said. And, I think you're probably aware of what that feels like when you just ask question after question after, even if you feel like there's certainty and you don't know how it could be any other way, but you go and you try to look for evidence that might turn your period into another question mark again. So that can be very unstable for the individual, no matter how much of a philosopher you tend to be. And then you're no longer integrating anything in your life anymore, because it's too much chaos. So there seems to be like a balance that's required there. And who knows how you can establish that balance where you realize, okay, I got to stop questioning and I just got to start living, which is, I think, why there's such a return to naturalism in a way. People just, even like animism, right? People just want to, like, I live here in Colombia, right? And I'm a part of communities where they teach indigenous um, knowledge to the Western world, and a lot of people come here searching for themselves, and they do medicine rituals, ayahuasca, that kind of stuff, and they just want to live on their baser instincts. They don't want to think. It's they want to stop thinking. They start being. So I think it requires a bit of both as well. But how do we find that balance between the thinking and the being? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
What
Oh
would be your
yeah.
ideas?
I mean, so I tend to think some of it, and this is also, I think, part of where physics and philosophy are often perceived. It may not be physics, but science and philosophy sometimes get perceived as at odds. There are not very many philosophers. Again, here I'm thinking of professional philosophers. There are not many of us running around thinking certainty is even possible, right? Except in really, really, like, maybe even unhelpful ways, right? I think that it's probably the case that I can be certain about the practical necessity of the law of non-contradiction. But
Okay,
so what?
okay, so this is where we're going to start getting into the weeds here a little bit, because
Yeah.
I think people there have to make the distinction between, when you say certainty might not even be possible, we're talking about on the objective level, between, in a manner of speaking, for consensus. But can certainty be possible in an individual's life and how they subjectively interpret the world? Absolutely. People are certain about things all the time, and then they get hit in the face by life saying, yeah, no, you were wrong, right? So, but that
Yeah, well,
certainty is something that has led a lot of people into success, and not happiness necessarily,
yeah.
but definitely well-being, because they're confident, they're certain about what they think they know, and that confidence is enough to get them through their lives, and then that's all that takes. So certainty as like a maybe as like a tool versus certainty as like an objective truth. I think we have to make the distinction between the two, and then, as a philosopher, if you're talking about certainty and whether we think it's even possible, it all comes down to the paradox. This is
Mm.
why my philosophy is called paradoxism. I dispense with deconstructionism. I dispense with logical positivism. I really dispense with everything, and I try to go at the root of logic, and where it doesn't break down, but where it gets paradoxical, which is that, is there such a thing as absolute truth? If you say there's no such thing as absolute truth, well, is that the absolute truth? So you start to realize it's paradoxical. If you say there is such a thing as absolute truth, well, then it just falls into infinite regress. Well, what is it? Right? Is it that statement? Well, that doesn't lead you anywhere. So to me, whether it's possible or not possible, I don't think is the right way to conceptualize that issue. It's understanding that it is paradoxical and that it's both. Maybe we need to actually accept that there is something beyond logic, beyond human logic, that is ultimately what creates that spectrum of nuance that we're always trying to describe in philosophy, infinitely so. That it's in fact both and everything in between, right? What's
Mm.
your ideas on that? How do you react to that?
I mean, that might be right. I'm certainly a fan of paradox. The technical term for this would be in the logical space is paraconsistent or dialectic, excuse me, dialetheism in logic. And people like Graham Priest and others have been defending this view. And uh, I don't know. I think I'm simply suggesting that the two words you were using, I like one of them. I'm not a big fan of the other. So I'm entirely fine with having confidence about where we stand, where we come down, what we believe, why we act. I think the language of certainty is always going to be, and this is a strong claim, might be false, but I think it's always going to lead to a kind of egoistic idolatry. Anytime the I am certain about Q, about P, necessarily what that leads to as a lived practice is not now being interested in talking to somebody about P or Q because I'm certain about it. This makes sense. Why would I continue to interrogate a thing that's certainty, even in my own mind? If I think X is certain, I'm not interested in talking about X. I'm interested in making disciples to X, right? And confidence, however, and again, I think we use these interchangeably in our linguistic practice, but I want to say confidence is a different thing. Confidence is saying, I'm standing here on purpose in full awareness that there are other reasonable places to stand. And that confidence is not one that then erases the risk that's involved in belief. It doesn't erase the paradoxical nature of human existence as radically fragile, and yet everything we do in life is trying to sort of narrate away that fragility. We are beings, says Martin Heidegger, defined by, he takes this from Kierkegaard, but we are defined by an essential anxiety. And that anxiety is not a fear of something, but an awareness of the necessary fragility and fallibility and vulnerability of my very existence. In other words, I am aware of my death even when I'm not thinking about it, right? My entire praxis, my entire life is a flicker. And that's a thing that's tough. And interesting to your theories of nothing channel, Heidegger says that the awareness of anxiety reveals to us the nothingness that is the condition of meaning, which is a really weird claim and it can get very technical. But my point is just, we live in a society defined by a narrative of success that is underwritten, I would suggest, by a commitment to certainty as the goal, even if subjective, which basically is I don't have to keep listening to people because I've got this figured out. And all of that, and here these are fighting words relative to the sciences, but all of that I think is then framed within a STEM notion of evidence of truth of human practice, which is science, technology, engineering, math. These are the kinds of things that lead to progress. These are the things we need to fund. These are the things we need to support because, notice, they are under, I think, the false delusion that they can yield something like certainty. They will necessarily then, in light of that certainty, provide success that can then be sold and consumed and then furthered according to a business logic, a business value set. So if we say, but maybe success is kind of effed up, not that we shouldn't try to be successful, right? I mean, your movement of trying to find unification, of bringing people together, I hope you are successful. I hope we are successful in these tasks. But the goal, I would say, is not success. It's what Mother Teresa talked about as faithfulness, right? And faithfulness in this sense for me is risking in a direction. I'm willing to risk that I was fundamentally wrong about love being the fabric of reality, but I'm going to do my best to live a life defined by love because I think that this is worth the risk of my finitude. It's worth the risk of my life. Does that mean that I could be wrong? Yeah, I could be wrong. But embracing that possibility, then living in confidence with an awareness that there are other reasonable places people can stand. And I can learn from where they have chosen to stand. And it may be the case that, my goodness, over a long relational period, I come to realize I just can't continue to hold the view about which I was confident. I've just got too much evidence and too many experiences. I'm going to have to rethink this. But that doesn't mean I'm now not successful. It means that faithful living, whether religious or not, is this existential orientation. And that's where I'd say yes to the paradox. We are confident, but confidence is only bred of humility. We are embracing risk and therefore standing on purpose, right? So that's the paradox that I'm going to try to celebrate because it erodes what I really do see as what the philosopher Aaron James calls the rise of asshole culture, right? Which is, I think, grounded on success, scientism, not science. I'm a fan of science, but scientism is a disaster where we only think science is truth, and a value set that says if it can't be monetized, it can't be replicated. Those are the things that I think the narrative of certainty, the culture of certainty leads into. That's the idolatry about which I worry. And so, yes, I agree with you. This is hard, but that's where I would
Yeah,
land the paradox.
it's beautiful. I would agree with pretty much everything you've said, and I like how brilliant that is. That you're shifting. It's not changing. It's not. It's a very beautiful and subtle but impactful move where you're shifting things from, like you said, success to, or let's say, certainty to confidence, success to faithfulness, and that sort of shift. It's beautiful because it's so objective and in a way that it doesn't ring any bells to the atheist who's like saying, "Well, you're a religion sneaker. You're sneaking it in there," or the opposite, right? Where you're, maybe a religious person is saying, "Well, you're taking us away from God's word, and you're being, heretic." But this is brilliant. I completely agree, and I think there isn't much else to say on that. It's so well put together. But it did lead me to asking myself a few questions and to get into some more hairy ways where perhaps we could agree to disagree personally. Your foundation, you said, was postmodernism, right? But you don't. I'm not certain that you are necessarily a postmodernist, but you definitely specialize in it. So I'm curious about that because
Yeah.
everything you're saying, I can't. I like that I can't put you in any one camp, but I'm very curious as to your worldview and how you explain things, and how you think we could bring philosophy to the world, and why it's so it so stands on its own 2 feet. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, so you have that, but you're a postmodernist philosopher. I don't know if you're a postmodernist philosopher, but let's say that's what you specialize in. So can you clarify that for me?
Yeah. So a lot of isms,
Yeah.
especially in philosophy. I mean, history is a little bit clearer, right? If you take like romanticism and realism in history and
Yeah.
classicism, those tend to be a little bit more discreet. So we can kind of get a handle on them. Isms in philosophy are tricky because part of what makes an ism worth thinking about is the actual debate among philosophers regarding what counts as it.
Yeah.
So postmodernism, I'll give you two of what I consider, and I've argued this in a bunch of my own writing, but I think there are two really big kind of overarching ways of making sense of it. One I reject and one I affirm. And maybe this, you can then say, oh, okay, yeah, the one you reject is what I think postmodernism means. And that's maybe where the confusion lies. Postmodernism, I think, can be understood as a metaphysical thesis or as an epistemic thesis. And the difference for people who may not know what these silly terms mean, metaphysical here, all that I mean is it's an actual view of what is the case, right? As opposed to epistemic or epistemological, which is a view about our relationship to the possibility of knowing what is the case. So these are two different registers. Metaphysical postmodernism typically wants to say there is no way of making sense of anything outside of our perspective, outside of our embodied location, outside of our linguistic context, outside of our hermeneutic or interpretive lenses. Therefore, there is nothing outside of that, right? So think Jacques Derrida, one of the biggest and most controversial names in this space. Deconstructionism, Derrida says there is no outside of the text. Well, if you read this as a metaphysical view, what he's saying is all that there is, all that the real involves is perspectives, it's experiences, it's my best guess and your best guess, because there is nothing behind that. This is where we can read, for example, Friedrich Nietzsche when he declares the death of God. We can read that as a metaphysical postmodern thesis. God is dead means there is no absolute truth. And this is a claim that is being affirmed as a perspectival premise. All there is fragment, perspective, embodied stuff. Now, if we just tweak all of that and make it an epistemic claim, there is no outside of the text, doesn't have anything to do with what is real. It just says, whatever real is, the only way I could be in any sort of relationship to reality is because of my lived perspectival, hermeneutic, interpretive location. So we stop short, if we're an epistemological postmodernist, we stop short of saying, therefore, there is no capital T truth, therefore, there is no capital R real. We just say, well, one of the options available to us as a lowercase truth about which I stand confidently, riskily, infallibly, I'm going to stand on the fact that there is capital T truth. Maybe that's a religious perspective, a metaphysical perspective, an ethical perspective, whatever.
Okay, so to me, it still sounds like you're not in neither camp.
Oh, I'm an epistemic one. I'm an epistemic postmodernist.
They both reach the same conclusion that there is no capital T truth, which I think we've already sort of established is a paradox. You can't even say that.
Well, I don't want to go that far. What I'm going to say is one of the possibilities for epistemic postmodernists is capital T truth might be the case, but it would only be the case as appropriated and affirmed and lived into riskily by me where I find myself. So here, the death of God doesn't mean there is no God, there is nothing there. It just means there is no external authority or external criterion by which my capital T truth can be affirmed as anything other than my lived existential commitment. So
sure, yeah,
I want to say that's the paradox.
I don't know. It's to me. Well, first off, I wouldn't even say Nietzsche was a postmodernist, and a lot of people misquote that. And I'm not saying this to you. I'm just saying this for the viewer. But people stop at the God is dead. But ultimately Nietzsche continues that and says, "And we have killed him." So I don't know if we can place Nietzsche in any category. Actually, that's what's so brilliant about Nietzsche. But to me, that paradox, like whether you're in the epistemic camp or the metaphysical camp, postmodernism, it's too close to solipsism for it to really be anything else but solipsistic. If you say, well, capital T truth doesn't exist, or it only exists insofar as my subjective view or my belief in local terms and all that, I still see that as, even through that phenomenological lens, right? You're still committing a paradox. You're still falling into that paradox. You say there's no such thing as truth even to yourself, and there you go, you've created an absolute truth. And so that to me it's incredibly chaotic. It's like the door to chaos, and I think that's why today we see so much difficulty for people to put their fingers on truth, because we've completely divorced ourselves from anything Enlightenment era, and there's no truth to be had between people. Now, could you fit in objective truth between people in the subjective experience and call that postmodern? You could, but at that point, it would just be semantics in order to say, hey, my camp is correct. So do you know what I mean? Like, I still feel like it makes no sense to be either a postmodernist or an objectivist at all. Like, I think to me it's paradoxical. It's both. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, but I think my point would be, only the metaphysical postmodernist has to bite the bullet of that incoherence. The claim, there is no capital T truth, affirmed as a metaphysical thesis, becomes incoherently articulated, because of course that is then a truth claim, capital T, that you are making. Epistemically, we're saying the lowercase t truth is that there is no capital T truth. I want to suggest that's where Nietzsche and Derrida both come down. Or the lowercase t truth is that there is capital T truth, and that's where I locate Kierkegaard and Levinas, and I put myself. So the point is, the paradox is not some metaphysical paradox in this sense. I actually think it's a radical awareness of the contingency of our discourses of truth. And that's where I do celebrate postmodernism and defend it. So if I were to say, the truth is that climate change is real, right? It's human caused, it's real, it's a threat to the world. Well, we could say that what I mean here is that it is capital T truth. It's the case regardless of one's perspective, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But notice what we really are saying is there is a particular narrated description of the world that is most likely to yield a particular future that is thriving, that is flourishing, that is joyful, that is moral. And I'm trying to articulate the truth of human-caused climate change as a moral concern internal to a space where I recognize, well, even the concepts of things like climate and human causation, these are already ideas that I'm deploying internal to language, internal to histories, internal to structures where those statements could then be true. So I want to suggest, is there a state of affairs that is mind independent? Yep, I'm a metaphysical realist. And this is where a lot of people say, well, then you can't be a postmodernist. And I'm saying, no, I'm a metaphysical realist. Yeah, but metaphysical realism is a view I hold from where I find myself, and I might be wrong, and I've got to then think about what that would mean to claim that in my spaces, in my communities, as a shared discourse. That's where I'm a postmodernist.
So you're both a metaphysical, you believe in metaphysical realism and an epistemic postmodernism.
Yeah, another way to put it is I'm a metaphysical realist and an epistemic anti-realist.
Interesting. See, that to me sounds extremely paradoxical, and to me, I love that. I mean, like, so I think right now, for all intents and purposes, people might be completely lost, and that's fine. I am following you, but at the same time, these are categorizations insofar as the way we try to describe how it's possible to live paradoxically, and how to justify that. And I think you might have done that for yourself personally, and I think it's brilliant. But at the same time, just because I like to play devil's advocate and really dig and test just to what degree can you in real time question your metaphysical assumptions. But ultimately, if you still hold a view that is paradoxical, insofar as in some circumstances, you use the example, you can use probabilities insofar as you have some truth that you think is true only to your knowledge about the metaphysical, or let's say objective world, outside of your subjective experience of it. Like, if you just zoom out of all of that, like that relationship between how you behave versus what you believe about reality, doesn't it all really come down to the question of, well, am I trying to live that way, or am I trying to prove to others that this is the way it is? So, like, what is it that you do when you explain that? Which one are you trying to do?
Yeah, so let me get a running start to that question by saying,
I don't know if I phrased it well. I was having a hard time conceptualizing the question myself. I didn't know exactly what I was trying to ask, but to me, I feel like, because of, to simplify it, because you seem to have one way of you have a certain belief about the nature of reality, and it is outside of the solipsism that I was talking about, and then but while you are living and dealing with the day-to-day truths, right, the lowercase p's, you do revert, let's say, to behaving as if though there is no capital T truth, and you seem to go through like a probability thing, and like in local time and space, and so on. So that seems to be perfectly fine if that's how you're using that as a description of how you live your life and how you view your own worldview. But is that now a statement that you believe is actually how things are and how people most likely operate?
Mm-hmm. So Soren Kierkegaard says, he's a 19th century Danish philosopher, usually identified as one of the founders of existentialism. Kierkegaard claimed that existence is a system for God, but it's not a system for any existing individual. And all I'm trying to say is, yeah, that seems right, but I want to tweak it and say existence is a system for God, probably, right? But it is unclear how it could be a system for any existing individual. And by that, I mean, when I claim that I'm a metaphysical realist, all I mean, to get rid of the vocabulary, the technical jargon, I think there are states of affairs that do not depend on my thought to be the case, right? However, what it means then to affirm those states of affairs as the case is necessarily to put me back into a space where language and concepts and history are the only frame from which I can begin.
Yeah.
So what I worry about is claims and discussions of absolute truth, which, for what it's worth, I tend to avoid as much as possible because I was raised in broadly conservative Christian communities where absolute truth became its own kind of idol, where any critique of absolute truth was going to be immediately perceived as a rejection of something like God's word. And though, and this is, some people might check out at this point, others might lean in and say, how's that possible? I still identify as Christian, but I identify as a Christian who makes more sense of Christianity because of my postmodernism, not despite it.
Oh, okay. So let me just slow down there, because now we're talking about theism and Christianity, and I want to understand, like, just how far do you go into Christianity and so on, and how that relates to your philosophical worldview. But so, for all intents and purposes, am I correct in steel-manning you here if I say there is an objective absolute truth or reality, but we are all tied to our subjective interpretations of it, and therefore there is no way for us to affirm capital T truth. So it's both. There is one, but we can't obtain it or describe it.
Yeah, I again, just some.
Or affirm it.
I'm going to italicize some words metaphorically. I want to say that when I claim that there is this state of affairs that is the case outside of my thought, that very statement is itself a particular located, embodied, risky claim on my part. So the idea of saying, well, there is this capital T truth, but I may not be able to know it. What I want to say is the very claim there is this capital T truth is already a lived, invested, risky claim. And so,
wow, okay. So I understand now. I get what you're talking about. So to carry that forward, does that mean you reject the cogito? You reject your own existence?
No, it's that my own existence is not something like Descartes, who presents the cogito. His claim is my existence is something that I can know for certain as a metaphysical postulate. What I want to say is, I do not know what it would mean to have this conversation except as committed to something like not only my existence, but your existence, which there's a long history of solipsistic objections here. But I want to say, no, I reject solipsism. I reject radical skepticism. I want to say that our conversation for me is sufficient evidence that you exist, that I exist, that we are able to communicate in ways that are meaning-making and truth-seeking. Okay. That's where, back to your original question, right, of, so is this something I hold or something I'm trying to deploy for others? It's
So
I would just collapse that distinction, right? What it is to live truth is to affirm it.
So can I then steel man and reduce it into an even simpler thing? Is what you're saying is that, you know, postmodernism ultimately, it's worth having doubt about any kind of truths that we decide to believe, whether it's capital T or not, right? It's worth doubting, any truth, like any truth, whether it's executive and absolute or solipsistic. Is that really how you subscribe to postmodernism? Is
I
just
mean, I
using that
tend
doubt?
not to, yeah, I tend not to talk about it as doubt, just because there's a very particular philosophical history of how doubt functions in a argument,
Yeah.
and doubt seems to make it look like, well, I ain't too sure about this, so I'm just trying it on. And I want to say,
Yeah.
no, the lived risk, the confidence that I want to advocate, grounded in humility, the faithfulness that is directed on purpose, the periods that I put down in my life that are still revisable, but they are also what give shape to even the questions that now can emerge. All of that work is maybe best said in a Kendrick Lamar track where Kendrick Lamar says, sit down, be humble. For me, that's how I'd put it. So I tend not to talk about it as doubt as opposed to certainty, because again, for me, that falls into the thing that I'm worried about. I'd want to talk about humility as a lived way of affirming truth.
So
Humility doesn't
then,
mean that I'm doubting my view. It's that I'm aware of the conversational contingency of the views that I hold.
I understand. So to me, that sounds like it's already going too far, even to say that postmodernism is a better way to have a relationship with truth, because that in itself is a truth. You see what I mean? Like it seems to fall into infinite regress, whereas the nuances that might erect from that you can erect from that are just so subtle and not practical enough that they don't really have any impact anymore.
Well, but
Or
again, if
meaning.
it's an epistemic thesis,
Yeah.
we're not claiming a state of affairs as true. We're claiming a mode of relating to the human understanding of that truth.
Yeah,
So
which is that
that's always going to be, well, that's always going to be different in a really important way that I think avoids the self-referential incoherence that you're pointing to. It
yeah,
instead says, hey, when I'm talking to somebody else, right? Let's say, and the reason I mentioned the Christianity stuff was just to give here's an example of where I'm committed that P, right? Whatever a P
yeah,
would be in my Christian life, but I don't affirm it as an absolute truth in the way that people fighting for absolute truth understand that idea. For
yeah.
me, it's what it means to say, I absolutely affirm the truth of Christianity is then the right follow up is, well, what do you mean by Christianity? Right? That's
Yeah.
exactly right, because it's only in that conversational space where we come to realize, even if I affirm truth that is absolute in the sense that it is grounding, that it is deeper than, that it is the condition of all other truth, I'm not suggesting that as something that is held outside of my lived engagement, my lived embrace. It'd be kind of like saying, this analogy has problems, but I think it's helpful. If you were to say to me, so does your wife love you? And I say, oh, yes. And you're like, prove it to me. Well, I really do believe that there is a state of affairs that is separate from my conceiving it, that
Yeah,
is accurately described as my wife loves me. I think that's an
yeah.
objective truth. The problem is, what does it mean to hold that as an objective truth? It means to live into a relationship of love with my wife. That
Okay.
just is what the affirmation means, rather than
So
saying it's a proposition that I can sign on the dotted line. I'm going to say, no, that's not how
yeah,
truth works
could
in this epistemic space.
So could we then reduce it? And I know I'm just doing this, I'm really driving you hard here. So could we just reduce postmodernism to just this statement, which is basically what it's all about is I believe in this, but I don't know.
I
And I
might
can't
know.
know.
I'm no, see that's one step too far. I might know, but from the best I can see, this is going to be something that I'll never know if I do or not. And so my summary of postmodernism is taken from a guy named Merrill Westphal, and he says postmodernism simply says, and this is the epistemic version,
Mhm.
postmodernism is the view that you can't peek over God's shoulder, right?
Mm.
So it might be the case that every belief you hold is the case. It is an accurate corresponding to reality, but you couldn't know that it is because affirming them is always a thing that is involved in your living. You can't get
Okay.
out of life to talk about it.
So then in epistemic postmodernism, there is truth, but you don't describe it as either relative or absolute. But there is truth. And it's a matter of belief, but that is subject to always changing because there's no way
One
to
one of
grasp it.
one of the ways that is a reasonable life
Yeah.
is to be invested in the claim there is capital T truth. But also, one of the ways that is a reasonable mode of living is to be invested in the claim that there is not capital T truth. This is the
Yeah,
tricky
but then
part is
that's
both
the
are
tricky
possible.
part. It falls into infinite regress because that just saying that it's reasonable to live that way or to see truth that way,
Mhm.
is that really reasonable, right? And is that true? So like that's what I'm trying to say is that everything either falls into a paradox or into infinite regress, and we don't really have
Yeah.
a choice as to which one we choose. And anything we try to erect like philosophical structure to understand that ultimately just falls into these categorizations between how we should view the world versus how we should behave in it versus how we should describe it versus, you see what I mean? Like this is
Mm.
why I'm very interested in postmodernism insofar as it is a fascinating unraveling and trying to understand the relationships between things, but it ultimately it comes to a sort of soup where
Mm.
again it's incoherent even in the epistemic side, um, because you're trying to create a structure, you know, insofar as how to apply this epistemic worldview. So as soon as you try to do that, you start to erect a capital T truth again. So you see what I mean?
I see what I think you mean.
Yeah,
I would simply say that only holds if you're taking the epistemic claims to be metaphysical theses. And I'm just trying to suggest there are epistemic theses that do not entail metaphysical states of affairs. And so all claims of things being true are lived investments. They are not simply accurate descriptions of what is the case, as if we could get outside of our existence to see if we're right. So
yeah, yeah,
my worry is um, that we can overread when I say it's reasonable that one live committed to the proposition there is no capital T truth, that it's reasonable to live committed to the proposition that there is. That that difference is precisely a metaphysical humility, right? I might be right. I hope I am when I say like I'm a metaphysical realist. I think there are capital T truths that are accurate descriptions of mind independent states of affairs. I hope I'm right about that. And I'm living
yeah.
my life committed to that hope because that for me is where things like racism are not just contingent evils because we disagree with the social preference. It's like, no, racism's evil because it violates some moral principle I think is inscribed into reality. When I say sexism or homophobia or whatever it is, my moral commitments, I hope my moral commitments are actually grounded in metaphysical states of affairs about reality being ethically infused. But here's the thing, I hope that's the case, and I live into that hope with the humility, recognizing I might be wrong, not because I doubt these things all the time, but because I'm engaging and invested in the fragility of that claim, right? The truth of this occurs in my living then in the world, fighting racism, sexism, homophobia, etc. So it's only incoherent, it's only the soup, as you say, if we force these back into metaphysical postulates. And that's where I just am always going to push back and say, look, you can't peek over God's shoulder to say that.
Yeah, but also,
but
aren't
we can
we?
live it.
Isn't that what the debate is all about? Like, what is the difference between metaphysics and the epistemological experience that we're having? Like, maybe, like now we would have to discuss, panpsychism and what God is and what is human consciousness relationship to those things. Are they the same thing? Are they different? Like, you see what I mean? Like, so if we dig a bit deeper, then we realize that we're already too far in discussing truth, because we haven't really discussed what fundamental truth, like reality, is. And like, we defined the terms properly. What is truth? Reality. And is reality truth? The relation, you know what I mean? Now we're getting into the like, we would have to dig into the epistemological nightmare to then really come to terms with whether epistemological postmodernism is sound or not. And again, we're back to square one, because whether we do that from the physics side or the philosophical side, we always run into the same problem that quantum mechanics seems to be telling us. It's both, right? Like, it seems to be both. Like, to me, everything you've been saying, we could reduce it to saying, yeah, there are truths, but there are no truths. And we go into this cycle, and we think that, in fact, there is one, but there is one when you look at a certain category, and then there's the other when you look at it in a different category. But ultimately, can we prove that these categories themselves exist? And we fall into infinite regress again. So do you see what I mean? Why I try to dispense with the epistemological nightmare. I dispense with like material reductionism. I dispense with all of it. To me, ultimately, the cogito serves to tell us, look, I have knowledge that I exist, whatever that means. Right, the identity of the individual James, or the universal self. Some people believe, the panpsychist view, and then when we think about these things, the nature of reality, what occurs in the experience within my consciousness? A paradox. So ultimately, I try to observe the paradox itself, and then everything I always observe is it's both. And whether that makes sense to me or not doesn't really matter, because that's where faith comes in, right? That's where I would say you can't peek over God's shoulder. Truly, is that you cannot understand things in a straightforward, logical manner. The law of the excluded middle applies within our existential construct, or insofar as we experience it. But beyond that, there seems to be a paradoxical logic, an antinomy, or a dialetheia. And that's what my video was about, that there's ultimately paradoxes within paradoxes within paradoxes, infinitely so. And ultimately, that there is a paradoxical logic in a way. And that to reach that synthesis, that third eye, that's the Trinity within Christianity, right, or the Trimurti in Hinduism, and so on, is that third aspect necessitates that you accept that it is both. It is the thesis and the antithesis, and that's how you reach the synthesis. So if we're just going to play with these categories versus, like, epistemological truth versus metaphysical truth and so on, we're always going to fall into that duality and in that cycle, and we'll never get out of the round and round. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it is motivated by exceptionally compelling commitments that I probably share if pushed. My worries would be, again, like maybe occurring at a register that is probably unhelpful for like popular consumption. So maybe I'll give you like my technical concerns, and then my maybe more popular applause. My technical concerns are I actually think what you're describing is grounded in the cogito really does invite charges of solipsism. So I know that's the thing you're worried about. I actually think that it would probably appear very quickly whenever we start moving towards some grounding of reality in the certainty of my own lived experience, rather than saying my lived experience is always already shared, it's already communal, it's already deliberative, which is why I keep pushing back to the epistemic being so important, is because it throws us now into the conversational lived experience, which is why intersubjectivity, I think, is deeper than subjectivity. So solipsism would worry me. Again, this is a technical sort of debate. And then the other worry I would have is, which is my critique of people like Graham Priest. He and I had dinner a couple years ago together, and we really went back and forth about this issue, which was when we embrace a both and paradoxical logic, when we affirm dialetheism, when we are paraconsistent, we're doing one of two things. We're either doing this as a kind of logical point about the failures and incompleteness of our logical systems. And that, I think, is really compelling. But then Graham had to decide if he was going to order the chicken sandwich or the salad. And he could order both. But the whole point was, like, the world in which we live, the experience of our subjective and intersubjective life, is necessarily an either or context, not a both and. And
yeah, absolutely. I understand where you're getting at, but I draw a distinction between, a statement of truth insofar as what is the fundamental reality, right? It's like insofar as creating a statement or a belief or a leap of faith, however you want to call it, there's a distinction between truth insofar as it is what it is versus how you're going to behave in the world. Like you said, we're chained to this idea or this need for, like, it collapses, right? You have to make a decision. There's like either or, but that either or doesn't mean that one is more true than the other. You could have chosen the other option. I mean, both were possible. It's just that the possibilities collapse, just like you see in quantum mechanics. Do you see what I mean? So to me, if we're going to talk about reality, we're going to have to talk about it in that manner, insofar as making a statement about what truth is or what reality is. And then when we're talking about how do we live our lives, what is moral, what kind of decisions should we make? Well, ultimately, that's why I subscribe to virtue ethics, because you have to realize, well, both are possible, and it seems to be a nuanced thing, and it's in the present moment that you'll know what is right and wrong, or what decision you should make. But you can't go forward in a deontological manner and say, well, there is a sort of ethical framework by which I can always be certain about truth. So that's where I would say, postmodernism is useful, or at least it's right. You can't. There's no ethical framework that you can erect that transcends time, or you know what I mean, that holds over time. But now we're getting really into the weeds here, and so I think insofar as postmodernism is concerned, well, let me ask you this: like, what question would you ask me now to clarify, so that I could think about it, and then that would clarify your worldview better? Maybe we could try it that way.
so you seem to be very committed to something that you are alternatively and variously calling objective truth or absolute truth or capital T truth. And then you're suggesting that whatever this is, it is paradoxical, right? So the capital T truth is paradox. I guess the question I would ask then is how, and again, it's going to be an epistemic question. How is it you relate to that assertion? When you say, I affirm paradoxicalism, capital T truth, the absolute truth is that truth is paradox, that both and always obtain. This is why we can unify physics and philosophy in various ways. If that's right, from where would you make that claim? What is it you would understand that claim as doing as a statement? Because my worry
So
is the humility
that's
starts sliding, right?
yeah, so that's a beautiful question. I mean, you've posed it, and I make that argument from my personal experience, which is subjective, which is, like you said, the most fundamental thing. And that's where I would say maybe the link between paradoxism uh, and uh, your philosophy, postmodernism, of course,
Yeah, yeah,
uh,
yeah.
connect, because that is the most humble position I can take. All I can say is it's paradoxical to me. I can't choose one or the other. I have to accept that it's both, and that, you know, I will choose one or the other in the present moment when the present moment occurs to me. And so that is the most humble position. That is the place where I'm not making any kind of assumptions about truth. And to me, that is the most true insofar as how we should view reality, and or at least how I view it, and how I should behave in reality. Right?
Mhm. Yeah. And then my follow up question, and again, we're kind of flirting with a weird space, which is trying, and I'm trying really hard, not to fall into the jargon and the technical stuff that like goes on at academic conferences, because no one wants to do that. We bore ourselves at those conferences. As one of my friends says, we read unreadable papers to each other while all the rest of them ignore it. So
Yeah.
we're kind of not really doing like pro work, but we're also definitely, like you say, in the weeds. And so it's a little bit less than just, popular discussing of complicated ideas. We're kind of in this weird third space, which I find really compelling. Um, but another worry that I would have is, well, look, and this is an objection that philosophers have made recently to the idea of pluralism, which I do think that maybe paradoxalism and pluralism are at least cousins of each other, where you can have multiple things true at the same time. And the problem with this is, if someone's a pluralist, they can't be a pluralist about the truth of pluralism, right? So if you're a pluralist, you must say exclusivism is false. And necessarily so, or pluralism doesn't get off the ground. So a pluralist can't say one of the possible plural truths is that pluralism is false,
Yeah.
right? And so the incoherence about which you are worried with, of what I rightly would say metaphysical postmodernism is guilty, right? The temptation to say the capital T truth is that there is no capital T truth, that worry I would have at a kind of performed register, where it's saying, well, look, if all of it's paradox, the statement that it's all paradox seems to be pretty non-paradoxical. Like
It is.
that,
It is.
right?
And here's how I deal with that. To me, it falls into its own infinite regress, which is paradoxism is both true and not true. And that's the infinite regress that it collapses into. And that ultimately leads to the experience of infinity. And then you start to realize there's a difference between a statement of truth and an experience of truth. And the only way to achieve the experience, if you want to use the logical route, is to fall into the infinite regress of paradoxism. That it is both there are and there are no paradoxes. Paradoxism is and is not true. And that's the infinite regress sort of road that I love to go down, because then I just think it's all infinite. It's all there. It's all there. Like, I experience it. I don't no longer need to be chained to duality, triality, unity. None of it. It's just an experience now. That's the door that I use. Do you see what I mean? And I think we're so close to
Maybe.
realizing that in any kind of metaphysical sort of worldview, is that if we're humble enough and we say, well, look, the only experience I have about truth when I try to think about it, or reality, or any of it, is what happens in my mind or in my experience when I think about those things. And it's a paradox. And then all you have to do is observe, and it's quite simple actually, is know the difference between the paradoxes that exist. And there are four or three, arguably, depends. And two of them are very special. They like, the antinomy is just, and I'm doing this for the viewer, I'm not trying to patronize you, but like, the antinomy is that truth emerges next to non-truth, or reality, something that can only exist through its own negation. So that right there, that beautiful paradox is so clean, it's empirical, it's a priori logic. So you know that it's empirical because you're experiencing it physically in a way. It's like a brain thing, right? In your consciousness, it's the paradox. But at the same time, it's logically valid. Like an antinomy is not false or wrong. It's just an antinomy. It's an emergent phenomenon. So there it is. We it's so simple. It's like asking to not to go further than paradoxism. To me is kind of like asking the eyeball to see itself. Well, I mean, that's not its function, right? So if you want it to see itself, well, just look into a mirror, and then there you go. That to me is paradoxism. You fall into infinite regress. You look into the mirror, and you're like, well, there's the eyeball, and it can see itself. And really, I already knew that I had an eyeball, but now at least I have a clear view of what that eyeball is, and that clear view is that infinity limited equation that I put together, which is just that the infinite regress of paradoxism. Um, so I'm kind of excited because I've never actually presented it and articulated it in this way before, especially not to a professional philosopher. By the way, I haven't even finished ninth grade, so I'm like not academic at all. I've really never really been part of schools or been good at being in school. But so you know, where where am I wrong? I would love for that to be disproven, or like if like maybe you will disprove it, but for me, I'm more interested in I want to be convinced that I'm disproven. Like I have to experience the logical flaw, and are you capable of doing that? Right?
Yeah, and I'm not all interested in disproving or proving. I think it sounds like
Yeah.
a
Well,
compelling
not necessarily
way.
proving and disproving, but can you point out the logical flaw in my argument? Because if you can, then you will really have completely blown away my philosophy, and I'm like, wow, that's crazy. And then I'll be, back into nihilism or something. I don't know. Maybe I'll
Yeah,
become a
that
postmodern.
that seems like a bad outcome. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I what I find really compelling about what you're articulating is the importance of not giving into problematic dichotomies that tend to threaten our social lives, our social justice, our conversational engagement. In fact, one of the things I find interesting, I mentioned Christianity earlier. Like one of the biggest problems I have with the mode in which right wing populism functions, which I also think is reflected in certain traditions of things like Christian evangelicalism in America, is everything is a dichotomy, right? Everything is stark. Everything is reducible to objectively X or objectively not X. And again, if what we mean by that is just the law of non-contradiction, I'm okay with that. Like I can get on board with it. I know you're going to push back because that's what paraconsistent logic rejects, but I'm actually okay with the law of non-contradiction because that for me is the condition of taking people seriously. When I say we've got to overcome dichotomies, that's because I think that nuance requires us to realize there's never just X and not X. There's also Y and Z and Q and P and R and S and T. Like there's probably a whole myriad set of places one could stand and ways we could understand things. And so one of the struggles I have often are people who grew up, say, in American evangelicalism think you are either Christianity means X or you're an atheist. Right. And so they meet somebody like me and I'm like, well, no, I'm a postmodern Christian and, I'm actually a Pentecostal, which is weird. And a lot of people think strange, but I'm also like really hard left politically, which again is not what people then like, well, if you're a Christian, then you must be, a political conservative. I'm like, well, I'm not, I'm a progressive. So the fact that there's a range of places one could stand. I like your paradoxism as an invitation to the recognition that there is lots of places one could stand. Like that seems right to me. And I'm
Absolutely.
on board
I
with that.
mean, ultimately, that is what I think it comes down to. I mean, because so to me, what paradoxism means is that all of these possibilities are infinite. You can have a multitude of different uh, contradictory beliefs, and just the fact that you are holding these cognitive dissonances, the psychologists would say, uh, and still functioning whatever correctly or doesn't matter whether it's correct or not, but whether you're functioning, you're living that way with that worldview, that shows me that indeed the impossible is possible, right? And that's what's so beautiful about it. But now we're kind of diving into, you know, you said and you've mentioned right wing, um, what was it?
Populism.
Your populism, and you've mentioned social justice, and it's interesting. So I don't want to get too political because now we're getting off track, and it's not really. But what would you say then? Because you said there are dichotomies. What would be the opposite of right wing populism? What's your what if you
Uh,
look in your own backyard, right? You said you're in hard left. So
Yeah, so I'm hard left, but I mean, what I would say is even being hard left, though, some people would understand as Antifa protesters and taking over the World Trade Organization and shutting down Wall
yeah,
Street, and
yeah, I know.
that's not where I stand. I'm a philosopher. Like I'm a deliberative democracy fan. So I'm
Yeah,
somebody who takes seriously the idea that um, ensuring and being committed to basic social minimums below which no existing person of dignity can fall. Like that's pretty important for me, and that's where I tend to be worried about um, narratives of populist thinking that are ultimately falling into a kind of authoritarian model of thinking, which I worry then eliminates the radical singularity and dignity of each and every other. So
yeah. But
my
how?
commitments are. Go ahead.
Sorry. It's just before I lose my question. Um, how then? Like, so it seems like you've tagged authoritarianism as something that's on the right, as if it's not something that can exist on the left. Is that correct? Is
Oh,
it is it
it can
possible?
exist. No, there's certainly left leaning authoritarianism.
Yeah.
It's just that it ebbs and flows in different ways in different historical times. Right
Mhm.
now, I would get accused by a lot of folks in my society of being authoritarian because I believe in more governmental involvement and action toward facilitating certain types of flourishing for all members of our community. They'd say, well, that's authority. I was like, well, no, authoritarianism is abdicating the deliberative process as the locus of justification. So
Yeah.
right now, the right as a global movement, and again, I'm a fan of really good conservatives because they make me have to rethink where I stand. Right. So this is not a critique of
Yeah.
conservatism. It's a critique of populist movements that are rallying behind the spokesperson of the they, as Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Heidegger and all of them will call it, where you end up with a kind of crowd think that abandons its investment in good reason giving. So my critique of populism is an epistemic critique. I think it lacks the deliberative virtues required in order to think well about how we live. So I'm a fan of the democratic political theorist Chantal Mouffe, who
Mhm.
says democracy, by definition, in order to flourish, requires more than a dichotomy, but it requires opposing views that propel each other to be even better articulated.
Yeah.
So the whole
It
point is,
balances.
well, yeah,
But
but not, it doesn't balance to a like mushy compromise. It
yeah.
stands in perpetual tension, almost like
Yeah.
you're playing tennis, right? If you and I are playing tennis and say we're
Yeah.
both world class tennis players, we're going to play. Sometimes you win, sometimes I win. But the whole point is, our playing each other makes both of us better, right?
Yeah. But this is
And
what's so
that's what I
interesting.
want to support.
Because it's, and I'm trying to bring it back to the postmodernism and dichotomies and paradoxes and all that,
Mhm.
because you seem to take a stance on one side, but you also are aware that both sides are required, and then ultimately you just have to go down to the data. I mean, like, first off, are there government programs in the states? I mean, just assuming because you're an American, right? So if we're talking about just the states, not in the world, because it's so
Mhm.
complex and it's
Right.
different all over the place. But in the states, you've had affirmative action since the 50s, and the counter arguments. I'm playing, devil's advocate. I don't want to,
Mhm.
unveil my position here, but You know, the 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 data seems to suggest from the other perspective that affirmative action has actually been pretty horrible ever since that was put into place. It's pushed the father out of the home in the Black community, and fatherlessness is ultimately what causes a lot of inequality and shittiness in any kind of community. So then, these government programs ultimately aren't helping. Now, that's not to say that government programs shouldn't exist at all. That seems to be on the other side, right, where that's hard right. But to me, if you say hard left and hard right, insofar as how you apply it politically, then we are talking about whether these programs are necessary or not. But if you're talking about hard left as a philosopher, then it's just saying that we should have government programs that support and has like a social safety net, right? So, but clearly that does exist. It's not being eradicated yet in the States, right? Like you still have welfare. I mean, you guys got payments during the pandemic and so on. So that's quite social, in fact. So I'm not sure. You know what I mean? Like, can you untangle that a little bit? Like, how do you? It's very interesting that you can be so aware of that tension that's required, but then still take a hard left stance. And so, do you take a hard left? That's my question. Do you take a hard left stance in the politics of it, in the actual nitty gritty, or is it just the belief that you need social systems?
Yeah, both. But doing this is, again, I am better at where I try to put the period down about my political life because I am constantly engaging with and friends with and seeking out the question marks posed to my periods by people with whom I disagree. Right. So
Yeah.
the idea is, it's interesting. So, in these sorts of conversations, like, notice we've talked about metaphysics and epistemology and postmodernism and complicated views about what is real and what is true and all these hard things. But as soon as it looks like, we're kind of talking about politics or religion, then it becomes like itchy, right? There's like, we don't.
Yeah, well, I want to clarify that. So I might seem like I'm poking the bear and I'm trying to get a rise out of you, but I'm not. Because again, I just threw some data your way, but who knows? Is that data true, right? That's all I'm trying to say is that's why I was playing devil's advocate. If I throw some data your way that can completely demolish I mean, it just makes you question your view altogether, then it forces you to go and look at the data. So it may very well be that, hey, the right is trying to get rid of when Trump got rid of all the immigrants, like, hey, you guys have been here 20 years, but bye-bye, you guys weren't actually, residents. And then that caused an insane economic downturn because they were actually part of the economy by then and they had families and so on. So that wasn't a smart move. And so I could go the other way as well. And I would have if you were taking a hard right stance. The experiment that I was trying to make was if you throw data into it, then all of that duality or that dichotomies we're talking about, it vanishes and you realize, okay, well, then we have to try to find the balance point. And you realize you need both sides, right? You do need some. So that's why I'm always playing devil's advocate with people. I'm sort of being Socratic, where I'm like being the gadfly and poking and saying, well, but I'm doing it with data this time. Like, hey, is the data really backing up your worldview? Because your worldview is correct in part. And I go on the other side. Your worldview is correct in part, which is why mixed economies have had great balance, we've done quite well. We're not completely socialist, and we're not completely capitalist, right? So we seem to be aware that we always need both, and that it is in fact both, and that there's a nuance in between, a whole spectrum, and we try to maintain that balance in like a sort of teeter-totter thing. So ultimately, it comes down to the data, and so if it comes down to the data, the question then becomes: do we become objectivists again? Do we throw out all postmodern view? Is it all empirical?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, my point was just that it's weird how when we talk about religion and politics, people get super nervous. And yet it seems to me that if we are good at the things that we're both calling for relative to philosophical literacy and engagement, that these should be the things we are best at talking about, right? Like, because they actually matter to us and they really do impact the way the world works.
Yeah.
That said, I'm a fan of this political philosopher named Rob Talese, who says the only hope for democracy is that we start playing softball and go bowling together, because
Hmm.
clearly, like, talking politics is not working. So maybe the
No.
better option is, hey, let's go get pizza and listen to a concert. Like, maybe that's the
Yeah.
only way forward. But no, my thought is the so data is only ever data relative to the frame by which it is interpreted. So if you were to say, look, the data shows that P, you're committed to not P, so shouldn't we then change direction? My answer is going to be probably. So that's why I absolutely say we need people with whom we disagree to be good at it, right? When I say
Yeah.
good at it,
Yeah.
I don't mean be a good conservative. I mean be philosophical in your conservatism. Like, be somebody who takes being a conservative seriously, and therefore seeks out and wants to be friends with and conversation partners with and wrestle with someone like me who disagrees with you.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the need, right? We need each other, because when we lose each other, then the problem becomes group polarization. And this is, clear in the data. Group polarization works when we are only talking to those with whom we share some horizon of affinity. And the problem is, when we do that, the whole room, the whole group will become more extreme. So if you've got a group of people who say, we only eat, salads, and we don't talk to people who suggest we should eat hamburgers. Well,
Mm-hmm.
one of the views among the salad people is salads should only contain organic lettuce. Anything else is not a salad. But you've got other people saying, no, you can have chicken salad, right? Like, there's all kinds of salads. Salads is a plural
Yeah.
idea. The thing that will make all those views avoid the extremism of the organic or bust is having somebody who says hamburgers are pretty good, y'all, in the space. As soon as the hamburger people say, we want nothing to do with the salad people,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
all the salads will move closer to the extreme. They'll move all toward, they don't meet in the middle. They all go extreme. And so
Yeah.
the extremism is then what creates a bigger gap between the salads and the hamburgers. And pretty soon they refuse to not engage. And now they see the other as dangerous, right? And so now they get even more extreme and start policing their boundaries even more severely. And
Yeah.
now, hey, don't let my salad son date the hamburger daughter, right? You end up with like a Romeo and
Yeah.
Juliet kind of antagonism. And that's the thing that I'm suggesting. Data is so important in political conversation. But notice, data is something that then has to be framed relative to what commitments are we guided by. So I would say, as somebody who identifies on the left, I am committed to freedom and equality being somehow maximally thought in terms of each other. My friends on the right say, no, equality can only be thought of in terms of freedom. So we disagree about this. But I absolutely want to say to my friend on the right, look, if your goal is to eliminate racism, to maximize human possibility, to see the face of each and every other, look, let me hear your proposals, because it might be the case that you've got better ideas than me. But if the goal is we're going to normalize white nationalism and we're going to normalize xenophobia, that's where I get nervous, right?
But I know what you mean. But I think I like this idea of this like polarizing spectrum, and then you've set it up well. But here's how I think it works. In the end, it kind of rebalances itself naturally, because here's the thing: on the opposite side, you're also getting some extreme stuff. You have on both sides, they start to meet around on the other side, and they end up being indistinguishable, right? Like the racism on the right is no different than the racism on the left now. I mean, now, if you look at the left, it's all about, well, you are valuable based on your race. Everything is through the lens of race. So it's like, you can't get into university if you're white right now because you historically, it breaks down very, very quickly, and they're not letting Chinese people in unless they take exams that are even more difficult, and you start to see it's really weird. So extremism is the issue. It's not left or right, and ultimately, like you said, if it's all relative to the framework or the context, and that context is that we all want to come together, well, then we have to share the same values. And the values that we seem to have chosen in our societies in the West is freedom. So I don't think that any argument either on the right or on the left makes sense when it eradicates freedom. And that's
Mm-hmm.
true. So people on the right say, oh, we should just be white people in this country. Well, that's not freedom. And ultimately, how do you determine white? What if I'm a quarter black or whatever,
Yeah.
And then on the left, it's the same thing. I mean, oh, only white black people should be in universities right now or in certain spaces. Well, how is that fair to people who are brown or whatever? You see, it falls
Right.
into this intersectionality that is just a fragmentation of like chaos. So to me, we have to come like the more that this extremity happens. In fact, the left. See, I used to be a leftist and like self-proclaimed, and then I realized, and we have a saying now. I don't know if it's in the States or in Canada or both, but I say this as well. Well, I didn't leave the left. The left left me, and I'm
Yeah.
sure people on the right are the same. They're like, well, I didn't leave the right left me. And so
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, the more polarization happens, at some point, it starts to eat itself in a way, or it starts to exclude its own in group because it's so extreme. And then people say, I don't subscribe to extremism, and so
Right.
there you are, you're kicked out. And then when you're kicked out of your group, your in group, you realize, oh shit, there's this whole spectrum and we're all individuals, we all have different places, and then we return to that balance. And that's what I'm trying to say is, hey, realize that there is an infinite spectrum. There are two extremes on either side of it, and that is the truth. And if you want balance, you have to accept that, right? Like you shouldn't play
Yeah.
on you like. I love the fact that you're very much you're a Pentecostal Christian, metaphysical realist, but at the same time, like that's to me is beautiful. And to try to bring things to a close here because my microphone's gonna die and it's also almost 2 hours. The the you know leading by example is more important, and I've really tried to push you as much as possible, and you've tried to resist as much as possible and push me as much. And the fact that we can do this without getting angry or trying to go low enough to start getting into ad hominems and all this,
Mhm.
we actually just showed people we are both trying to achieve a higher truth together
Mhm.
by doing this sort of like asking questions that even if you're coming from a specific point of view and is more likely to trigger you emotionally, the point is we are experienced with this is what philosophy does. It helps with emotional temperance. um, and uh, and I just think that we did a good job today doing that, and that you're a fantastic dialectical partner, man. I
Well, I
really
appreciate
want
that.
to have more of these discussions, and next time from a more curious point of view where I'm not playing devil's advocate, because I would like to learn
No.
more about modernism and how it
Yeah.
works.
No, I mean, I I
Yeah,
I appreciate that, and I think you're exactly right. We should model the world that we want to see. One of the things I mentioned earlier about philosophy being weird and hard to get people involved in is that one of the reasons I think is that philosophers, when they I think are doing it well, um, it's not that we can't be offended personally, right? I'm offended by all
yeah,
kinds of stuff in the world, right? I'm offended by willed ignorance and
mhm,
apathy and all kinds of, hatred of the other man, the other person. Like I find that stuff offensive. However, in the context of deliberative conversation and deliberative engagement, philosophers are really hard to get angry, right? It's like,
yeah, yeah,
because we're necessarily hearing the objection as um, either a misunderstanding or a point of clarification, or so the ability to stay in a conversation all the way. Like there's this great dialogue of Plato where Socrates is talking to this guy named Euthyphro, who's a real kind of willfully ignorant person. He's very caught up in his own ego. He's very proud of he's the smart one. Everybody needs to listen to him. And Socrates is like, oh my goodness, Euthyphro, teach me then. Right.
mhm,
And so Socrates is like playing the fool. And I don't think he's being sarcastic. He's saying, well, shoot, all right, let's see. Like, I'm open. Let's see where it goes. So they have this conversation. Eventually, Socrates kind of shows that Euthyphro doesn't know what the heck he's talking about, and he's got himself all turned up in knots. And so Euthyphro says, see, Socrates, you've brought us back to the beginning. We know nothing. This is so stupid. And Socrates says, awesome. So now we understand why that direction didn't lead anywhere. Let's start again. And Euthyphro says, I got to be going. And he walks away. So there's almost a like, the goal of philosophical conversation is not to win, right? But there is a kind of like philosophers need to be able to outlast those who are going to get angry, those who are going to get offended, those who are going to get ad hominem, throw low blows. And eventually philosophers may decide, you know what? I got to walk away from this conversation because it's not just unproductive, but it's now detrimental to modeling to others what it looks like to be good at this. So there are all kinds of public engagements on Facebook and stuff where I've gone back and forth. And then eventually it's like, now you're kind of like just being anti-Semitic or whatever. And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to walk away from this, not because you've outlasted me or you've beaten me, but because I'm not interested in having a conversation that makes it look like I'm okay with some of the ways you're doing this. I'm going to have to leave, So it's important to know sometimes we got to say the best model is to say, I'm not going to continue talking to somebody who's engaging this way. But otherwise, I
would disagree there, actually. I don't want to kick up another conversation that's going to last another hour, but I would disagree. I think the more that someone is doing something you disagree with, especially as a philosopher, I don't want to place the responsibility on you, but personally, I feel responsible to speak to them because who else is going to speak to them? They're going to get even more radical and underground and so on. But if I can speak to them and ask them questions and I have racist friends, not full-on racist friends, but you can tell that they're not exposed to enough culture and people and the fact that I'm able to just ask certain questions at certain times and make them think, and then they say, like I have an example where it's a friend who he isn't full-on racist, but he could be radicalized quite easily if you were to fall into that crowd. And he's like, oh, I got these Indians, I've never seen them before, and they're working, and they're always loud and horrible and just being, late and just they're not very professional and all this. And he's generalizing in a big way. He's like, oh, I hate Indian people. Okay, well, now you're talking about hating an entire group. It's one thing to say there's Indians at work are like that. That's a statement of truth. That's a statement of truth. I'm no censor, and I think there are some things that are true. What can I say? If it's a group of Indians, they're a group of Indians. So what? But to apply it, to take the individuality away from an individual by putting them in a group, and I'm like, dude, there's something billion Indians, and my experience with Indians has been very different than yours, and they've mostly always been awesome. So he came like, yeah, you know what, that's right, because I think people mostly will appeal to logic, like they will fall into like the logical. They don't want to be illogical. It's almost like they're not racism, but their idea, if it's shown to not be logical, they'll want to be consistent more than they'll want to just be right, because they know that if they just say no and they start to argue against something that logically clean and simple, they're just going to make themselves look like an idiot, right? So, but you don't at the same time. That's why I'm saying you have to at the same time have the charm and the tact to be very unassuming, not judgmental, and just say, well, that's interesting that you think that. My experience has been different, and here's why. And I think maybe it's a generalization that you're making. That's entirely different than saying, oh, you're racist and this, and I don't want to talk to you anymore. It's like, well, there's a guy in the States, a very famous case. He did a TED talk. He actually collects Ku Klux Klan members garb, because he talks and he befriends them and he changes them completely. Now imagine if we had set up that rule where hey, stepping away is what's, now you don't have to. That's another thing. Like if I don't want to deal with someone who just their intention is to just get my goat, and they're not, you can tell that they're closed-minded and that you've tried a couple of times and really the conversation isn't going anywhere. Yeah, I walk away for that reason, but I wouldn't walk away because I disagree and that it's my moral responsibility. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. My point was, if the conversation is unproductive in ways that make you think the immorality or irrationality of my conversational partner is overriding the possibility of engagement, then I'm just saying, I think sometimes people feel like they want to be committed to philosophy, they want to live this way, they want to model this, and then it ends up like putting them in almost quasi dangerous spaces, right? And you know what, that emotional exhaustion and emotional trauma is not something. I'm just saying, like, feel free not to feel like that's what this looks like. Right. So yeah, and there's also context matters. You know, if I'm talking to somebody and it's me and the other person at a restaurant, at a table, thinking through stuff, that's a very different space than if I'm, you know, on Facebook or on Twitter or, you know, doing something in public, right? All I'm suggesting is philosophers should be, and I think all humans, but, you know, we should be slow to wrath, right? We should be slow to dismiss. I posted a video on my YouTube channel just 2 days ago, maybe it was yesterday, I forget, but about Jacques Derrida and the ways that we can read some of his work to suggest that the way I see the other is being able to listen to her, right? And so I'm with you entirely on what you just said. I just think that it's important also to remind people, hey, sometimes self-love and self-care and a commitment to truth looks like being able to say, you know what, this is a conversation I'm going to need to walk away from.
Absolutely.
I just think it's important people to know that. So anyway, but I've enjoyed this one, man. Thank you so much for having me. It's been good.
I agree there. We've found some extreme differences. We found some places where we overlap, and I love that we've come together, and you know, it just makes me wanna. It gives me hope. You know what I mean? It really does, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you again. Aaron, thanks for coming on. Is there anything you want to say? Let anyone know like where they can find your work or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if anybody has stuck around for 2 hours and 6 minutes, God bless you. I appreciate the long form possibilities. But yeah, anybody who's interested in thinking with me, in joining the sort of community that I'm trying to build and contribute to, please go to jaaaronsimmons.com. There they can get registered and subscribed to my monthly newsletter. It's got music recommendations. It's got highlights of different public philosophers that they might want to look into. I do long form videos that are early release just to the subscribers on the newsletter. I think something that's compelling. I hope people enjoy it. And then also, please go over to my YouTube channel, Philosophy for Where We Find Ourselves. Get subscribed. That's where I do weekly videos, 5 to 10 minute sort of thing, short, not a big ask, that are taking complicated philosophical ideas, making them accessible, explaining them, and then showing how we can put them into practice in our everyday lives. And those two spaces are where I'm doing most of my work. I'd love for them to get hooked up with me there. They can also follow me on Twitter. They can follow me on Facebook, etc. All those links are available via my website. All the previous podcasts I've been doing, recent other public interviews, all that's available there on the website, jaaaronsimmons.com. Thanks, James. It's been an honor. And maybe next time we can get together and talk about Martin Heidegger's theory of nothingness, which might be a lot of fun for the theory of nothing community. So
that would be fantastic. Yeah, maybe it's a little project we could start on this channel too. I still have to read Being and Nothingness, so I got to get around to that first. But that's a great idea. Thanks a lot, Aaron. Thanks everyone. The links to Aaron's work and places will be in the description, and I'll see you on the next one.